So they just wanted to ask for prayers.
Okay. Say that one more. Sasha.
Sasha. The Anderson
Sasha
family.
did?
Yeah.
The son.
Oh,
James.
James. Is that
They're at Wilmington.
it's the yard?
Testing, testing.
And so we see that he does this throughout chapter 3. Thank you. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, Paul speaks of how it was the gospel that changed the Corinthians' lives. In verses 4 through 5, he talks about how his sufficiency is found in God and not himself. In chapter 3 and verse 6, Paul tells these Corinthians that the Lord made him a minister of a new covenant. And in chapter 3, verses 6 through 11, he speaks about how this new covenant is better than the old covenant. And so again, Paul writes this second epistle defending his apostleship. And here in chapter 3, we see that he defends his apostleship not by exalting himself, but by exalting God and by exalting the gospel itself. And we see that he does this by speaking of how the new covenant is much better than the old covenant. And we see this in chapter 3, verses 6 through 11. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul asks in verse 6, "Who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit? For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now if the ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. Indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all because of the glory that surpasses it. For if what was being brought to an end came with glory, much more will what is permanent have glory." And so, again, we see how Paul speaks of how the new covenant is better than the old covenant by comparing the two covenants. Based off of this passage, can you name some of the differences between the old and the new covenant? Paul says the new covenant is better than the old, and he talks about how the two covenants are very different in the passage that we just read. Can you name some of those differences? Okay, good. So under the old law, only the Levites were the priests, but under the new covenant, we are all priests. Good. Any other differences that are noted?
I would say the Old Testament had a lot of rules and specific things that they either had to do or couldn't do. And the New Covenant is really based on loving God and loving your neighbor. There's not a bunch of, got to do this on this day, and you can't do this on this day. So it's a lot simpler.
Right. So one covenant, as the text says, was written on paper or tablets of stone, while the other covenant was written on the heart. Yes.
The problem they had then was they couldn't decide or didn't know or wouldn't get through their minds that the first 5 commandments stayed or were redone. The rest of them after that weren't.
Okay, good. In verses 6 through 11, what are some of the differences that Paul notes between the two covenants? Yes?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're looking based upon this passage, one thing that he points out is that the one had a glory that was fading, while the other has a glory that will remain forever.
Good. Right. So one had a glory that was fading, and one has an eternal glory. Good. Right. So the old covenant kills, the new covenant gives life. Any other thoughts? One is old, right? And the other is new. One is of the letter, and one is of the spirit. One kills, and one gives life. One is a ministry of death, and one is a ministry of the spirit. One is written on stone, and the other is written on the heart. Both covenants were glorious, though one covenant is more glorious. One is a ministry of condemnation, the other is a ministry of righteousness. One covenant is no longer glorious, while the other is still glorious. And we talked a lot about this in detail this past Sunday, and so this is just a very quick review over what Dan discussed on Sunday. But you see here in verses 6 through 11, there are many differences between the old covenant and the new covenant. And the point that Paul is making here is, obviously, the new covenant exceeds and is much better than the old covenant. Yes?
Yeah, just kind of go along with what Lynn said, talking about the priesthood. One, the old covenant had many high priests. The new covenant has one.
Right.
And that's Jesus Christ.
Yes.
We are priests, but it makes it so much easier because you think about just the Sanhedrin, right? They would argue things. They would try to determine what was law. And Jesus decided, one part of the Godhead decided what the law that is written on our hearts is.
Yes.
And so him being God, it makes it so much easier for us to, and that was part of the old covenant of death, right? It was the ministry of death. So anyway, yeah, just thought I'd add that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There were a lot of actors in the old covenant, lots of leaders, lots of people who were making decisions and doing a lot of different things that were very important under the old law. But now that we are under this new covenant, Christ is the only high priest, and he has established the law that we are to follow. Good. All right. Which of these contrasts stand out to you the most? You can share which one or ones stand out to you, and there's one that really stood out to me that I'll talk about after you all share, if you have any. The one that stood out to me was the ministry of the Spirit has even more glory. And the fact that the ministry of the Spirit has even more glory implies that the old covenant had some glory. If the new covenant has more glory, then the old covenant had to have some glory. And that really struck me because most of my life, whenever I think about the old law or the old covenant, I think about something that was imperfect. I think about something that was outdated. I think about something that was useless. But here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul's not saying that the old covenant was useless. He's not saying that the old covenant was dated. He's not saying that the old covenant was ineffective. He literally says that the old covenant was glorious. And it served its purpose. Very good. A question that I ask myself is, what made it glorious? Paul says that the old covenant was glorious. The new covenant was more glorious, but the old covenant had some glory to it. What made it glorious? Yes.
Well, it was holy. It came from God.
Right.
His purpose. But it emphasized man's unholiness. He couldn't measure up to the standard.
Right. Good. So I'm glad that you said that. The old covenant literally came from the mouth of God. Moses went on Mount Sinai and he received the law from God. And we'll talk later how when Moses was in the presence of God, his face glowed because he was in the presence of God and because he was receiving the law that had some glory. Any other thoughts? So that really stood out to me. Why would people still want the old covenant if the new covenant is so much better? I mean, it's literally called the new covenant. It's written on the heart. It's a ministry of the Spirit. It's more glorious. It's a ministry of righteousness. Why would someone prefer to have the old covenant if the new covenant is so much better?
Couldn't they change?
Okay, it's hard to change. You're right. And if they grew up in that environment, if their parents or their grandparents, it's hard to just change overnight. Yes?
Source of national and ethnic identity for the Jewish people. I think they saw rightly that the Gentiles were brought in to be their equals, standing with God. They lost their place and they had their minds exclusive.
Yes, very good. So the old covenant kind of gave the Jews some sense of prominence. It helped them stand out among the rest. But this new covenant is not only for Jews, it's also for Gentiles. And so these Jews who basked in being God's chosen people through this old covenant were no longer able to do this once Christ came and established the new covenant. Good point.
The context, the comment that was made earlier about it serving its purpose. I think the timing of when the law was given to the people was after several hundred years of being under Egyptian rule and not having an identity and not having any say in anything. And so they almost had to learn to be a nation, and to do that, and this is the way my simple mind has always thought, in that it required a very prescriptive approach.
Yes.
Therefore, laying out the Jewish laws was necessary.
Right. Good. Good. And some people like knowing exactly what they can do and cannot do. I'm that way. I like to see what your expectations are. And perhaps that was how many of these Jews were. They like to know, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that, thou shalt not do that. But that wasn't what the new covenant was like. They didn't have the New Testament written down like we have today. And so it wasn't as rules and regulation as the old covenant was. And some people just might not have jived with that very well.
Do you not think today that some people like to look at the New Testament and try to figure out what the rules are, as opposed to being God's child and just acting based on the love that they have for other
Correct.
people?
Right.
They
Yes.
want a checklist.
Yes. And I'll say, I think this is a better way of saying what I was trying to say earlier. The old covenant seems to some have more structure than the new covenant. I'm not saying that it does have more structure, but it just seems to have much more structure in our human minds and in our human eyes. Dan.
Well, and I was going to say that actually, Tim, because we have to remember that the context of the New Testament is the Old Testament, because the law of Christ is the fulfillment. It's not different. It's the fulfillment of the Old. And so
Right.
So, you know, yes, there are plenty of rules we live by, but it's just a different mindset.
Correct.
But again, we have to remember, the Old Testament is our schoolmaster, is what it says.
Yes, yes, very good. While you were speaking, I also thought of something else that might have caused some of these people to want to hold on to the covenant. Jesus wasn't the king and Messiah who many of these Jews were expecting. Perhaps they thought someone else was going to come who was much more glorious and wonderful in appearance and behavior even than Jesus. Jesus was a humble man. He was a man of sorrows. He was killed on a cross. And a lot of these Jews were not expecting the Messiah to be like Jesus was. And so maybe that's why they were still holding on to some elements of the law.
They didn't know all of God's plan yet. There was still a lot that was mysterious to them that they didn't know, that wasn't revealed.
Right.
They didn't know the end game, so to speak.
Correct. Very good. All right, so again, the point that Paul makes in 2 Corinthians 3, verses 3 through 11 is the new covenant is better. As the text continues in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 through 18, Paul's point is, if you are unwilling to accept the fact that the new covenant is better, then you are spiritually blind. And Paul makes this point by speaking about Moses, the Judaizers, and Christians today. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, in verse number 12, Paul says, "Since we have such a hope, we are very bold. Not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face, so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end." As Paul continues to speak about the superiority of the new covenant and the spiritual blindness of those who refuse to accept the new covenant, he begins to speak about Moses. And he alludes to Exodus chapter 34. Let's read Exodus chapter 34, verses 29 through 35 very quickly. So again, Paul in this section is talking about how the new covenant is better than the old covenant. And he is saying those who refuse to accept the new covenant are blind. And he makes this point by talking about Moses, and he's alluding to a scene in Exodus chapter 34. Let's start in verse 29. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, as he came down from the mountain, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. Aaron and all of the people of Israel saw Moses, and behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all of the leaders of the congregation returned to him, and Moses talked with them. Afterward, all of the people of Israel came near, and he commanded them all that the Lord had spoken with him in Mount Sinai. Verse 33, when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. Whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would remove the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the people of Israel what he was commanded, the people of Israel would see the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face was shining, and Moses would put the veil over his face again until he went in to speak with him. And so here in Exodus chapter 34, we see that Moses is on Mount Sinai receiving the law from God. He comes down from the mountain to talk to the people. And while he's talking to the people, his face is glowing. His face is glowing while he's talking to the people about the law. And when he finishes talking to the people, And before he goes back to speak to the Lord, he puts a veil over his face. And he removes the veil when he talks to God. And we see how this pattern continues again and again. Moses would speak to God. Moses' face would glow. Moses would speak to the people. The people would see Moses' glowing face. After speaking to the people, Moses would veil his face. Moses' veil would be removed before speaking to God again. And so the question that we ask ourselves is, why? Why did Moses' face glow? And why did Moses wear a veil? Does anyone know the answer? Right.
Until he went in to see the Lord again. That's the basis of the whole analogy he's going to build on the fading of the law of Moses.
Yes.
It was, I don't want to assign bad motives to Moses, but it almost sounds like for him it was sort of a pride thing. My face is shining, and you all see it. I've been in talking to the Lord, but if I leave my face uncovered, you're going to see that it doesn't last
Right.
until I go in to see it again.
Yes, you're exactly right. Moses' face glowed because the law that he received was glorious. The law that he received was glorious, and being in the presence of God was also a glorious thing. Moses veiled his face after speaking to the people because, though glorious, the glory of the law was fading. It wasn't meant to last forever. And Paul makes this point very clearly in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 7 and 13. In verse 7, Paul says, the ministry of death, which is the old law, that was carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end. As we talked about earlier, the law, the old covenant, was glorious. It was a great thing. It was a wonderful thing. It was something to behold. But that glory was fading. Moses' face glowed because the law was glorious, but he wore the veil because that glory literally faded when he left. We see it in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 7, and we also read it in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 13. Moses, who put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. And so, after speaking to the nation about the law, the radiance in Moses' face faded because the law was fading. So, to keep the Israelites from seeing this fading glory, Moses veiled his face. The question that we ask ourselves is, if the law was glorious, why do you think God allowed it to fade? What purpose did the law serve? And we talked about this some just a few minutes ago. Good. So the law was a schoolmaster, Galatians 3, verse 24. Some translations say the law was a tutor. And as Carrie said, the law helped us understand that the wages of sin is death. The law helped us understand that we need to make a sacrifice, or a sacrifice must be made to atone for our sins. The law helps us understand what holiness looks like. And the law teaches us about Jesus. And so the law was good. There were wonderful aspects of it. It was glorious. It was so glorious because it shows us what a holy God looks like, and it points us to Jesus Christ, who is perfect. Yes.
And I think there's no question about any of these things, because the greatest teacher that the earth has ever seen regarding the law was Jesus himself, who came to fulfill it. So when you consider the fact that yes, the law was imperfect because it was pointing to him, there was still no greater teacher of it than him, which tells us what? The law is extremely important still.
Right.
We still do need to study it.
Sure.
It's not like you can read the New Testament and find out all there is to know about the Spirit or God or creation or all those things. There are so many things. I mean, you look at the prophets, the major and minor prophets, their interactions with the Almighty. They tell us about God, things that we wouldn't see in the New Testament. So the whole thing it just fits together so perfect.
Yes, very good. And we see this word in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, fade or fading. When something fades, that doesn't mean that it's completely gone. If I have a red shirt and after 10 years the red shirt begins to fade, the shirt still is somewhat red. And so I kind of hesitate to say this, but I'm going to say it. Even though the old covenant has faded, even though its glory has faded, that doesn't mean it doesn't still have some glory to it. Does anyone disagree with what I just said? You feel free to. But I think what Dan said is absolutely right. You can't understand the new covenant without having the old covenant. And so we don't just totally throw away the old covenant. The old covenant is still important. It still has some glory, but it has faded. And the new covenant has much more glory. Something that is faded is still somewhat red. It's just not as red as it was 10 years ago.
Well, and we also kind of said this on Sunday, or maybe I beat it to death, I'm not sure. The new law is the ministry of the Spirit, which is a big deal, because in opposition to what Paul says, which he calls the old law the ministry of death, the ministry of the Spirit gives life. And so the Spirit is working in a way in our hearts that we can't quite explain. In fact, we may not even quite be able to understand, most of us. I don't completely understand it, but the Spirit works now. The Spirit was always working. The Spirit was moving over the face of the waters in Genesis when the earth was created. But the Spirit works differently now, and so it brings life to us that we did not have before.
Right. Good. Very good. All right. So here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul talks about Moses to describe how the glory of the old covenant has faded. And now he continues to talk about these Judaizers or these super apostles or these people who are still trying to hold on to the whole law, or they're still trying to hold on to elements of the law. in addition to what Christianity requires. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul continues in verse 16. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So we see I think I skipped a part. Let me back up. Let me back up to verse 12. Since we have such a hope, we are very bold. Not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. But, verse 14, their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the old covenant, that same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. I didn't read verses 14 and 15. That's why I messed up. But we see that Paul makes the point when these Judaizers, or these people who are still trying to hold on to elements of the old law, when they read that law, they still have this veil over their hearts. It's not a literal veil. They have this veil over their hearts. They're refusing to see the fading glory of the old covenant. The old covenant was glorious, but it has faded. And you have these people that Paul is writing to the Corinthians about who are refusing to see how what was once glorious has faded, and now there is something more glorious through Jesus, and they're refusing to see it. There are some who are still holding on to the faded law by placing a figurative veil over their hearts. They have ignored Christ and the new and better covenant that he has established. My question for you is, in what ways can someone today hold on to elements of the law without realizing it? Okay, believing that our works and our works alone will save us. That's what the old law was about. It was about following these rules and regulations. And if you didn't follow one of those, I think it was 300 something rules, then you'd have to have an animal killed to atone for your sins. And it happened year after year after year after year. Anything else? Any other ways? Okay. It's not just Judaism, it's Islam as well. There are even some, quote, Christian denominations that hold on to some elements of the law as far as dietary restrictions as well. I have one way that we can focus on, or we can hold on to elements of the law, is by focusing on external behaviors more than the heart. And Paul talks about this some in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We can prophesy, we can speak in tongues, we can give our body to be burned, but if our heart isn't in it, it's worthless. The old covenant was all about actions. It was all about the action. But the new covenant is about the action and the heart. And so we can do a whole lot of good things, but if we're not doing it in a spirit of love, in some ways we're still holding on to elements of the old covenant. Any other thoughts on this?
Tim, I don't know if you were thinking this direction, but I think sometimes we treat baptism that way. That we're so concerned with baptizing somebody and not concerned with changing their heart.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't think about that, but you're right. Once they're immersed and come up out of the water, sometimes we forget about them. And we fail to realize that Jesus said in Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, make disciples, baptizing them, teaching them to observe all things that I've commanded you. And so there's still some learning, there's still some growing that must happen once someone becomes a Christian. It's not all about the action of being baptized. Being baptized is important, that action is important, but there's much more that we should continue to do as Christians. All right, so in the first section, Paul talks about Moses, and he talks about Moses to describe how the glory of the old covenant has faded. And then he talks about these people who are still trying to hold on to elements of the old law, and he uses the analogy of the veil. It's as though they have put a veil over their heart because they're unwilling to accept Christ and the new covenant. And then he finally talks about those who accept Jesus, those who accept the new covenant, those who follow Christ, those who turn to the Lord. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, in verse 16, Paul says, but when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So there are some who are holding on to elements of the law. They have put a veil over their heart, and so they're unable to see how the old covenant has faded. But there are others who have turned to the Lord, and they have unveiled face. And because they have removed the veil, they are able to see how glorious and wonderful the new covenant is. And they're being changed day by day from one degree of glory to another. When someone turns to Christ, the veil is removed. They can clearly see the glory of the new covenant. They experience freedom, and they are gradually changed to become more like Christ. Moses represented the glory that faded, but Christians represent glory that increases. Yes?
You know, I was thinking about this section earlier this week, and this is the kind of thing this is the kind of language, and these are pieces of the word that absolutely 100% convince me this is from divine, because this is the most beautiful picture when you put it next to the synoptics. At the crucifixion, when Jesus died, we know the exact moment when this changed. The veil of the temple was torn in two.
Right.
And this is they're a type of each other.
Yes.
The veil of the temple, the veil over Moses' face, the veil that Paul talks about here. There's just no other religion that goes to this kind of depth and beauty that exists that I know of. And it's incomprehensible. You can keep pulling layers of this back, and you'll still never reach the bottom.
Yes.
It's gorgeous. That's all you can say.
No, that's an excellent example, especially about the veil of the temple being torn in two from top to bottom. And you just see elements and, as you said, layers of this throughout Scripture. Exodus 34, Moses' face glowing, Moses wearing the veil. And it's not explained in Exodus 34 why Moses' face was glowing and why Moses wore the veil. The veil of the temple being torn in two at Jesus' death. That's not really explained either. But then when you get to 2 Corinthians 3, it all comes together and it all makes sense. And as Dan said, there's no other religions that are so intricately woven and masterful as Christianity is.
I mean, this is thousands of years of history.
Right.
Just completely wedded together in perfect harmony.
Yes.
It just could not have happened by accident.
Right. All right, so let's wrap this up. As was stated earlier, Paul's primary reason for writing this second recorded letter to the Corinthians was to give a defense. Here in chapter 3, he gives a defense. His ministry, as we see, is of the new covenant, which brings freedom, life, and transformation. The super apostles, or the Judaizers, or these people who are holding on to elements of the law, they promote the opposite of what the new covenant promotes. The law, burden, spiritual blindness. They promote something that has faded. And so earlier in chapter 3, Paul talks about a letter of recommendation. Paul did not need a handwritten letter of recommendation. If the gospel that Paul preached removes veils, brings freedom, and transforms lives, his ministry speaks for itself. Paul's ministry is much better. Are there any final questions or comments about anything that we've discussed this evening?
I always feel sorry for the Judaizers because I feel like they spent a lifetime trying to understand the small. And in a moment, basically on the cross, they're supposed to give that up. Now, these Judaizers are probably in it for themselves because they're wanting these letters of recommendation. They're probably wanting it for, but I'm just talking about just as a general, as a Jewish person during this time. It would have been easier to be a Gentile and have no hope to become hopeful.
Right.
They had something. They had this fading glory, and it was hard for them to give it up. And so
Yes.
I have a little bit of sympathy for them if they're truly unable to walk through that door. Because I don't know, I try to put myself in that situation and wonder, would I have been able to give up a whole lifetime of what I knew for something that was better, but different?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I really enjoyed studying through this chapter because I learned a lot. I wasn't really familiar with all that in Exodus 34 and how that tied to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. I found that to be really interesting, and I think it's a very good explanation for why we are no longer bound by the old covenant. As we talked about earlier in our discussion, there are a lot of religions or denominations, if you will, that hold on to elements of the old law, but we see that we are under a new and better covenant. All right, well, thank you all for your comments, and we will continue this study on Sunday. Dan, I'm assuming you're going to cover chapter 4? No? Okay, that's right. Okay.
We have a bit of he'll be teaching Sunday for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then he'll come back.
Okay. So the next 2 Sundays, Colin Thompson will be teaching, and this coming Sunday we'll be in chapter 4.